So the end of the story is that they actually just changed one sentence in their code. But let me show you what that sentence is and how they went about it, because it's really fascinating what they were able to do at the most local level in their community.
Hey there. Today we're talking about the fact that Norman, Oklahoma was able to change their parking requirements to parking suggestions very easily, doing some simple code reform. And yet it feels like it has that sense that this is something that happened by magic. And so with me today is Edward Erfurt, our chief technical advisor at Strong Towns, and he's going to talk through the specifics of how they actually went about doing this. Our goal in this series is to be able to provide you with a glimpse into the specific mechanics of how to make stuff like this happen, how to fix an intersection in 80 minutes, how to hack your code, how to do small things that have a significant impact, often without creating any suspicion or any sense that there's some big, drastic, draconian change that's being proposed. Oftentimes, our communities feel like they are just locked in place, and the suburban experiment has fostered that sense that nothing should change. And if anything changes, it has to be drastic. And so we take the opposite view. A lot of change should be occurring. It should be incremental in nature, and it should be done at the local level by people that are most equipped and empowered to do that. And so I hope that that is you, that you are in your community looking under the hood, saying, how do I detangle the code so that I, as a resident, or I, as a staff member, or I, as a city council member, might be able to take action in my community? And so, Edward, jump in, tell us about what Norman did, why it matters, and what others can do that would be similar to this.
Great, thanks, Norm. Let me share with you just some thoughts on this. As I talk about Norman, I want everybody to think about their community. We're not here at Strong Towns to tell you what to do. There are things that Norman did that maybe won't work in your community, but there is an approach that they use that we at Strong Towns want you to think through. They did an approach in Norman that I think is really, really smart. When we talk about communities, when we talk from a Strong Towns perspective, we are not here to tell you what to do. We're here to help you help your community think differently. And Norman went through this experience. When we go to our core principles of Strong Towns, we talk about complex systems. We talk about challenges we have and the responses that we put forward. This is much different than the complicated systems that I think we are more familiar with, where somebody says we have a problem and voila, here's a solution. Many, many times when we're working with consultants or we're working with specialists, they're going to provide a solution. In Strong Towns, we are really, really focused on responses and looking at lots and lots of mini responses to address the struggles in our communities. So when we think about complicated systems, we naturally go to complicated responses. And I want to show you what that actually looks like. I'll talk here briefly about a Strode because I think we're familiar with a Strode. There's lots and lots of problems in this particular intersection. When we look at this particular intersection, the one I will focus on for this talk is the person right in the middle. The problem is that people are crossing the street. We don't know why they're crossing the street, but we know that they are, so therefore we need to make this safer so they can cross the street. When we look at lots of complicated responses and we ask the technical professionals and the consultants to solve the problem, we get something like this.
Mhm.
They have solved a problem. They've gone and highlighted, you can see in the middle, the crosswalks are now like brightly marked. They've got curb extensions, they've added traffic lights, there's push buttons to alert folks that pedestrians are coming and to slow cars down. At the same time, we saw all of those turn lanes. Those have all been consolidated. Now we see they've consolidated them into one, two, and even three. All of these things are there. And meanwhile, while we're doing the work, let's throw in the bike lanes and some greenery. This solved a problem, but it didn't address a struggle. Right now, if I was to ask folks on this one, this is an area that pedestrians would be afraid to go in and drivers would be frustrated to drive on. This is just a fancier version of a Strode. And in fact, after this was built, it's still the deadliest street in Florida. We could talk broadly from the transportation side. Transportation engineers are easy to pick on, but we also have this issue in our planning world. we set up all of these kinds of chutes and ladders when we go through to try to respond to our built environment. And I love this. I was introduced to this in Savannah, Georgia. This particular game was not developed by a planner. It was developed by a business owner that made the mistake of trying to open another business,
Mhm.
and all of the different processes and steps that they had to go through. Very orderly, but very complicated, very difficult. It made it to the point that he created this game, and now the city is playing the game with residents and elected officials, trying to figure out how to get those big boxes off the table. As we talk about these types of codes and we start to untangle this, we need to recognize that we're not talking about radical change. We have seen new codes come in and deal with radical change. But we also need to recognize that the codes that we have, that the parameters in which we are doing development should allow for change. These should be living documents. So the question that we're always asked, and I think the question we're being asked here that we want to try to begin to address today is how do we shift that conversation in our community? I know everybody's familiar with this, and I can't present it enough. This four-step process for public investment. This is not just about building something in your community. This also is something that works when we're dealing with struggles in our community. And I would argue that in many places, you already have the codes you need for the communities that you desire. And that code reform is way more than just switching ordinances, writing a new piece of code that you're going to stick in, or omitting something within your code. It is really thinking about this as an operating system. Now, we shared and wrote a story about Norman, Oklahoma. Norman, Oklahoma had a parking issue. The parking issue was that their zoning code was established in 1954. All of the parking requirements for their community were established on parking rates and analyses from the brightest minds of 1954. In 2013, city staff began to realize that maybe we have advanced quite a bit as a civilization since 1954, and that how do we deal with parking? So the end of the story is that they actually just changed one sentence in their code. But let me show you what that sentence is and how they went about it, because it's really fascinating what they were able to do at the most local level in their community. This initiative they went forward through at a staff level. So let me walk through a couple of things that I think are important that if you are looking at codes, maybe you're not as familiar with, especially if you're a local citizen. When we look at this, most of our communities across North America, or at least in the United States, are in a catalog system that's free and easy to get. It's a service called MuniCode. In their library, they have a map of all these places, and you can highlight over the states. I'll click on to Oklahoma. They have all the cities that have archived their codes here, and we have Norman, Oklahoma. This is their entire municipal code and their charter. It's searchable. You can find all of the text there. When I'm reviewing codes, I type in keywords, which we can do up here to find the different sections of code. So if I want to know about fences, if I want to know about parking, this is an easy way to find it. You can also go to other places and review what their code texts are. So this is something that planners do all the time.
Mhm.
They are not inventing new codes. They're finding language in other places that they're moving forward. This is the parking section for the city of Norman's code today. Very little has changed in this. So we can talk for what's actually on the website because this is what many of our jurisdictions look like. There's usually this type of table that has use and then the number of spaces.
Required
One required.
normally. Yeah.
And so when we look at this particular setting, we have all different types of funny names, uh, all fine grained pieces. Again, this particular code, its DNA was birthed back in 1954. Very little has been edited or omitted in this code since that time. So we can see lots of names here. When you go to a public hearing, it is very difficult to get folks to break away from all of these types of specific pieces. I don't know how many taverns that are in your community, but taverns show up all the time. I'm sure there is a great reference to that somewhere in their code to define it. Radio and television repair. I know we're all going out and having that, but these are things that are in our code.
Mhm.
Uh, these are things that we can easily get distracted in when we're talking about the four-step process. If our objective here is to go and deal with freeing up decision-making on parking, getting rid of parking minimums, we can talk about all of these, but that doesn't get us to our ultimate objective. But we can see all these different uses. I'm sure these are all in your code. In 2013, city staff at the city of Norman began to go through the process of trying to figure out how to make this better. Uh, that approach, I assume, was trying to see how to consolidate these numbers. I assume that as they went through, there was battling over different types of retail. Uh, Whenever we get into parking codes, all of a sudden it's like, well, remember the one time at the bowling alley in 1960 when everybody showed up for the World Tournament and there wasn't enough parking? Remember the one bar on the corner that was there for Super Bowl Sunday? Remember when the popular pizza place was next to the popular Blockbuster? These are stories that people have embedded in their knowledge that make it difficult to go through.
Mhm.
In So Norman began to look at parking. This is where you start looking through all of those different codes. When they began to look at parking, we can follow the history of what they did with parking because within the structure, once we know where the codes are at, the next aspect that one would look at is how to get these things changed. Like I said, 2013, Norman started to talk about this. In More recently, they began to review their codes to figure out how they could improve these and make it better.
Well, and you see this with places like my community where they said, oh, in our downtown or village area, we're going to adjust the numbers. So they look at all of the categories and they move them all down by, one space or zero point 0.7 of a space. That's the one path of reform. But you're going to talk about something which is a much more strong towns friendly or much more incremental version of that change.
Yeah, so when I look at the process here, uh, what Norman did is they began to talk about parking.
Mhm.
When they looked at the reform of this, and I looked through their meeting notes, they were looking at how they could update the rates of parking. So they had new uses that had been introduced to the city. So again, we're moving forward from the past. They were trying to deal with the new uses. Uh, Norman is also a very progressive city. They're dealing with environmental issues, most specifically stormwater. They have a stormwater issue in Oklahoma. So trying to do light imprint, trying to do low impact development standards. There's no easier way to tackle that than to depave a community. So less pavement, moving that forward. And then also there was a political push of let's getting rid of all of the parking requirements. Let's make it so they're not required in that process. Starting in 2013, these discussions were starting forward. Looking at the history of Norman, this became more evident in in our current times, where they began to look. Locally, people began to share stories that we had from Strong Towns. They shared passages from Jane Jacobs. They identified and met with builders and developers that realized that they couldn't build the traditional downtown that they wanted. They also were getting new development moving in where vacant parking lots were now viable retail spots.
Mhm.
And the underlying story in Norman is their funding, their primary source of revenue is parking, or is not parking, is sales tax. So parking doesn't generate sales tax.
Mhm.
A new Chick-fil-A, a new retail business, those generate sales tax. That generates revenue for the city. So the conversion of these is really important. when you look at a place like Norman and we look at their codes, they began to look at the specifics of their code. And in their agendas and minutes, we can begin to see what they were doing and what they were thinking. And this was no easy task. This is the code that they have as existing today, or existing prior to the update. So this is what staff presented to elected officials, and they had several boards that this went through. So they can see what their duty is to provide the off-street parking, the number of spaces required. They have some crazy numbers. It's hard. One of the things in here when we talk about changing the code, how do you count for 1.2 spaces? If you get do we round up or down? How do we do half a space? So those are kind of difficult. Some of the
My
numbering of
assumption
how
is it almost always rounds up to the nearest whole number. Is that certainly that's the case in Delta where I live.
it varies by code.
That's so interesting. Yeah.
And if it's silent, then it's up to the discretion of the reviewers.
Right.
So we can see all of the items within this. When somebody is updating a code, and I will show you on their site, and I'll share the link to their council meeting. Norman actually is really, really good at sharing lots of information. If you go to their website, you can actually go to their agendas and minutes. You can punch in the dates. You can find whatever meeting, whatever board. They have an agenda. So this is the items that they're going to discuss in the meeting. The agenda package has everything that staff has collected that they've shared at the meeting. When they finish the meeting, they create minutes. And then they have audio and video for all of their meetings because they go up on YouTube. If I go to the meeting, the final reading for this, everything is compiled. So you can actually watch as this is being presented, but there's also in the agenda packet, all of this information related to this particular item. And it's kind of buried at the end of this because that's the way they set up this particular meeting agenda. But you can see all these hyperlinks. So this little item 27 has all of this information in it. What I found really interesting in here is as I click on the staff reporting for this, staff really spent the time to outline the history of why they were here. They also presented parameters of what were needed for parking. This is in a very strong towns language, even though it's not a strong towns written piece. These are people that are thinking through this process. And what came out of a very long process is this idea of recommendation versus required. By looking at their parking code, if I look at the document that they have created, when we look at the updated ordinance, anything that is underlined is new language in their code. Anything stricken is language that is being removed. So as we go through, when we look at the three objectives they were trying to achieve, update all the parking rates, so change all those rates, try to insert green building standards whenever possible, and to look at getting rid of the parking mandates. When we look at what they move forward on, there were certain rates they could get adjusted and some they could not. So when we talk about the four-step process, what is the next smallest thing? Well, these were some of them. The next smallest thing was to remove and move around some of the parking requirements in the code. In Norman, they're highly sensitive to the university and the fraternities and sororities. So that's not going to change that rate. That's just a no-go. But some of the other things when it comes to apartments and it comes to boarding rooms, again, when we're talking about a college town, these are places where college students are coming, so one person per car. When we look at the housing that they're moving into, we can see where those rates are coming in. So they were able to achieve all, not all, but some in there. The other component is looking at a simple change in the code where it says the number of off-street parking spaces recommended.
Yeah.
By changing that and changing a title from spaces required to minimum recommended, it now provides the opportunity for staff to work specifically with the city or with developers in the city to look at all of the conditions.
Mhm.
So if I have a development in the main street, in the urban area, if I have development that's adjacent to an apartment complex with a big parking garage, I have the ability now as staff to make regulated decisions on the amount of parking. So when we look at these, they added that simple piece. They also identified
I'll pause you there.
some,
So you said they can make regulated requirements. So the shift is that the city staff are still reviewing it and then identifying what the proposed sort of agreement or compromise position would be.
yes, it allows for staff in a development review process to review the project within the larger whole.
Okay. Hmm.
So it's not a blanket. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's not 100% by right.
Hmm.
You have to actually go in and work with staff to show that this could happen. Uh, in Norman, they have really talented staff.
Hmm.
If people that understand their community, their staff is sensitive to what's on the ground. Norman is a community that they are focused on lots of public engagement. So when they're used to lots of people showing up to meetings and participating, staff's aware of that. So when we look at the parking requirements, when a development comes in, staff has the ability to look at that development. The developer has the right to ask for what they want. They have the ability to make those adjustments, and they're working with staff. What we heard from staff working through our community action lab about how this was working on the ground, that small shift of getting from from required to recommended resulted in the first 18 months, 4 new developments underway in downtown Norman. 4 developments that otherwise would not have been built. 3 of those developments were able to be built because the parking minimums had been lifted off of the project. They're able to do infill, they're able to do more mixed use in a compact, walkable way. So they let the markets ride on that. The fourth one came in, it didn't need the adjustment. They wanted to have parking, but they had the flexibility to look at that and work with the developer and encourage them to reduce what they may show. Again, being more sensitive. So not only can staff say we need more, but they can also say we need less.
Hmm.
With the adoption of this code, the one thing that they wanted to achieve that they haven't quite gotten to yet were the green building standards. So this would be the things that would be more sustainable in the development pattern. Uh, by reducing parking, by opening up the door to this, that is the next smallest step that they are undertaking. But there's more analysis and more consensus that has to be built for those pieces. But when we look at this code, the text, and I'll show you again, the text that they are working on. Um, we have a simple change, a heading change. Um, so number of off-street parkings required. So adds clarification in their code. They removed, you can see the strike through, removed some problematic administrative issues within their code. And the big one was this, the number of off-street parking spaces recommended. And when we say they changed one word, it's right here
Hmm.
in their
Required to recommended.
table,
Yeah.
required to
Yeah.
recommended. If I go back to their code as we showed,
What he used to be.
when we look at their code, spaces minimum recommended. And I find it kind of funny here when I look at the Muni code, you can see the font's much bigger on this.
Hmm.
This is something really to celebrate.
Mhm.
So by a fluke, it's actually quite big to really make sure that folks know what's there.
Yeah.
Um, so that
And
didn't
and
require them
it's
to
one of those things that
negotiate.
like the market will always require some degree of parking, we can assume, until we live in a car, if ever there was a carless society, there would probably still be the requirement for some type of parking of another type of vehicle. But like there is always an underlying sort of like rationale for providing parking in a place. The question is like, but under which sort of umbrella should the decision making of how much parking to provide exist? And in many cases, you'll actually say the person that has skin in the game, that really has sort of the obligation to provide for the people that intend to use the building that they are constructing, they're going to be very like tied in to that question, and in certain uses be able to say, actually, I'm very confident that there's a market for what I'm providing. And in many of our communities right now, the vast majority of them still, until parking reform really takes hold, there still isn't that viable pathway. So Edward, yeah, this is fantastic. Any sort of closing things for those that are still watching? Truly, hats off to you, because we know, and we've said we need to provide content that really captures what you are interested in, the things that would help you. This is the first of a series that we're going to be doing, where we're looking at various very top topics, but going deep and under the hood. So, anything more that you want to add for the practitioner or the passionate civil advocate that is taking this on?
Yeah, I don't want to lose sight of how large the city of Norman is and the variety of urbanism that they have. Um, we have the downtown Norman is a small piece,
Mhm.
and the university, but Norman is a big place. There's a lot of rural and agricultural area within their community. They also have a lot of retail on I-35. Lots of different types of urbanism. The thing that's really kind of genius with this idea of switching something from required to recommended is that it allows for all of the things to grow and mature throughout the entire city. So it's not something that is only specific for the 6 blocks. I think when people talk about overlays and freedom of something in one area as experimental, we always see whenever that happens, it's always 1 block short of where the next cool thing is going to happen. When we're trying to get codes approved, when we go through that political process with the public, we have very diverse communities. We have a complex human habitat that we're in. So that on the edge of town, there may be a need for a lot of parking because it's someplace that everybody has to drive to. That is a reality. But that is a much different environment than what's in the downtown. So this allows for that next increment of development throughout Norman. The other thing that I will share is that Norman has now, I told you 1954 is when they adopted the code. In 2013, they began the process of amending the parking code. It
Mhm.
took to 2022 to actually get that through. They then moved much more rapidly, more recently, when they adopted an accessory dwelling unit ordinance
Mhm.
to adjust the parking to accommodate a parking relief for those smaller units. So what took them over 10 years to move forward, initially, they were able to do in less than 10 months
Mhm.
with accessory dwelling units. So that next smallest step of this approach, this incremental piece, saying we're going to try to work at this at a that will work across our entire city, and that we, at the time of an individual proposal, can look at its existing condition of where it's at in relation to its surrounding area, is very powerful for the development community, very powerful for city staff, and it allows that next increment to occur with the least amount of resistance.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, I think we're going to leave it there. And I do want to say that attached to this recording, you're going to find a lot of the links that Edward has referenced, as well as the video that we did on parking reform to help spread the word about this. As always, we're grateful for our partners at the Parking Reform Network as well. They have resources there that are also of value. But as you specifically engage with this topic, if you have further questions, don't hesitate to reach out to either John or myself. I mean, Edward or myself. And another key part of it is perhaps if you're in a community where the appetite for this still isn't quite been cultivated, one of the things you can do is work together with a local conversation group to try to encourage more people to care about this topic and to really take hold. In other places, if you begin to take action, definitely pass it along to us because we want to celebrate and cheer what is taking place. There are so many orderly but dumb systems in place in our communities, and we are here to foster and spur on that movement of chaotic at times but smart approaches to addressing the challenges and the distressing situations that face many of our communities. So with that, thanks for watching. Appreciate your time.